Welcome to Talk of the Town, a podcast in partnership with the City of Winter Park, Rollins College, and the Winter Park Chamber of Commerce. I'm Betsy Gardner. I'm the president and CEO of the Winter Park Chamber of Commerce, and I'm joined today by Mayor Sheila DeCiccio, the first female mayor of Winter Park, and Sam Monger, who's with us from London, who's an economist with The Good Economy. We'll go into more of that later. Sam will be joining us in September as our keynote speaker for the Winter Park Outlook, sharing thought leadership on economic development and innovative land use. We are so thrilled to be joined by both of you here today. You know, our goal in looking at these issues is to imagine and reimagine existing development. We have an opportunity to enhance our city and the quality of life for our existing residents while solving for current and future challenges surrounding what we call attainable housing stocks here and ensuring that it's aligned with the upscale environment that Winter Park is known for. Some of the vision and goals we have in exploring this is making sure that we're building walkable, compact pockets that are human scale. So in other words, no big buildings, big noise, or big congestion. Streets that are planned for human activity, not high-speed traffic. And then again, walkable centers where your needs can be met on foot. Redevelopment, of course, that's in tandem with nature and green space and considering the natural environment as a stakeholder in our redevelopment ambitions. And then redevelopment that encourages enjoying activities and socializing outdoors, making sure that the design is careful and that we have little wasted space. And certainly that it incorporates more amenities for existing residents. And finally, and very importantly, that it increases the taxable portfolio of real estate to make sure that we're financially sustainable as a city. As we know, strong cities are future ready. They plan for and solve existing and future challenges, which is the challenge. Large community challenges need what we call tri-sector leadership to help solve for some of these really thorny things. And we see a role here for the chamber through the lens of the independent sector. We can identify problems and mobilize resources. And then the government's role naturally is to release the regulatory burden, to create incentives and to stimulate some of the private sector investment that might take place in the right environment, where we want to invite capital to come to the table. And that's exactly the kind of work Sam's been doing in London, in a rich kernel of London called Mayfair. Many of you know it as tourists. It's where Buckingham Palace is, it's where Piccadilly is, it's where people want to be when they go to London. It's certainly where they want to live in London. So I want to welcome Sam this morning. We've got a couple questions for the mayor and for Sam about how all this weaves together. Sam, your focus is on place impact investing in London. Welcome. Can you share a little bit about what that is?
Yes, thank you. And thanks very much for having me. So place-based impact investing is a concept that's been gathering a lot of pace in the UK over the last 3 years since The Good Economy wrote a white paper on the subject. And I guess at its essence, at its core, it's really about bringing long-term institutional capital to work in places in ways that deliver better outcomes for local places and communities. It covers areas like housing, like finance for small businesses, green energy, natural capital, and a range of other things. Areas which are both asset classes that fund managers will have funds built around, but also which are important policy domains for local government where there's investment needed to deliver better outcomes. So the real key of it is how do you embed accountability into those models so that the investors are doing that investment in a way that is beneficial rather than extractive, and that's what we really focus on.
Well, that's in a nutshell. That's pretty amazing. Thanks, Sam, for that little introduction. Tell us, in your words, because you're obviously English and I'm not, but in full disclosure, I lived in London. Can you tell us a little bit about how Mayfair, which is where, when you were with the Grosvenor Estate, you did a lot of your work. How are Mayfair in London and Winter Park similar in your perception? I know you haven't been here yet, but how are places like Winter Park and Mayfair capable of burnishing a brand that already has a distinct and elevated identity?
So just to sort of put a bit of colour on it, so Mayfair is owned by Grosvenor, which is a property company that's owned by the Duke of Westminster. It
Who
has.
just got married, we heard.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, well, that's the current Duke. I mean, it's a very long-term investment. I mean, if you talk about patient capital, they've been in property in the West End of London for about 350 years, which is pretty good going. And yeah, so there's about 300 acres of central London. And when it first came into the Grosvenor family, it was literally farmland, and it's now some of the most valuable real estate in the City of London. It's bounded by some of the most well-known retail streets in the world. So Oxford Street and Bond Street, people come from all over the world to go and shop there. And now, as you say, I haven't yet been to Winter Park, but I've heard a lot about it. And I think some of the things, from what I've heard, I think some of the similarities are they're very appealing places to live and work. They've both got very strong heritage, a lot of history that's worth kind of reflecting on and celebrating. Quite a high proportion of fairly high net worth people who choose to live there. And that's reflected in the high real estate values relative to the areas they sit within. So I think those are probably some of the main similarities from what I've heard. And actually, a lot of what you just talked about in terms of walkability are sort of similar, and those kind of ideas are similar to what we were looking at Grosvenor. Burnishing a brand, I think it's an interesting way to frame it, because I think it's worth reflecting that, because my role at Grosvenor, I was strategy director there for about 10 years, which is an immensely privileged position to be in a company with that sort of time horizon that looks over. I mean, I've talked to a lot of strategy directors in companies where the strategy horizon might be 3 years or something, and I'm looking out, 50 years or so. So we really have the opportunity to think quite hard about the role of Mayfair in a city like London. If I just talk through what we did there. So about a decade ago, I was asked to develop a 20-year vision for Mayfair and also for Belgravia, which is the other part of the West End that Grosvenor owns. And I think the reason we wanted to do that was because we sort of knew we had a strong brand, but we almost took it for granted. It was very sort of, we recognized we were in danger of getting a bit complacent about it. So, for example, when we built an office building, we never really worried about having to print it because we just knew that people would come because it was Mayfair. But then we were starting to think, actually, with all the changes in technology and remote work, and this is pre-pandemic, obviously, but we could recognize even then that technology was changing the way people worked, and therefore, we couldn't take for granted that people were always going to want to come and sit in Mayfair unless we did something active about it. So we put the strategy together. I guess the key things we did in terms of doing that, the first thing was really looking hard and critically at what our existing brand actually was, and it's in doing that we took a real 360-degree view of all the stakeholders who had a view of us. So whether it was the local council, local residents groups, local business groups, and also people in other parts of London and elsewhere in the world, to say, if we say Mayfair, what does that mean to you? And also Belgravia, and actually also asking some of our own people internally, and we literally got people to take maps of the area and kind of spray paint them with like green for good, red for bad, so we could identify which parts of the estate people thought were working and which weren't. And then we also made a point of looking outward. I think we'd recognised we were quite insular. We would sort of tend to look at the boundary of our estate as like almost as if there was a physical wall there, which clearly there wasn't, and anyone walking through London wouldn't see that. So how do we plug into what was going on around us, and also how do we compete with other places? So there are other parts of London that are also very desirable, but also recognising that we're part of London and therefore intricately linked with London's fortunes as a global city. So thinking quite hard about what would happen to us if anything were to happen to London's international brand. So we looked outward, and then the last part was that we looked forward. We were trying to think, what does this place need to look like in 20 years' time? And we actually, in doing that, we had a lot of historical resources drawn because, of course, we've been around for so long. So a lot of the original estate was built when the mode of transport was horse. So all the streets were laid out at a time when people were travelling around by horse and cart. A lot of the things which are now houses were originally developed as stables for horses. So looking at how the estate had already adapted to changes that nobody could have foreseen when the estate was first built, and then thinking, how would we respond if something equivalent to that was to happen again? What would driverless cars do to us? What would, people getting drone deliveries into their office buildings, how would that affect us? So I think that's kind of, in a nutshell, how we went about it. But you can kind of see from that, it wasn't a simple question. It had many layers to it.
Thank you, Sam. Over to you, Mayor. I am so grateful that within weeks of your election, we were able to sit down and frame a kind of couple of agenda items, and you've been very attentive to our agenda, really our first priority, which is looking at real estate and housing, and we're so grateful for your thought partnership on that. We talked about what the city can do in terms of stimulating capital investment to help us solve problems and get somebody else to pay for the price tag of doing so. When you're thinking about tri-sector solutions, what excites you most in terms of thinking differently about how to solve for attainable housing and helping Winter Park be future ready?
I believe it's a multi-pronged approach, just as you laid out in the sector. What Winter Park has done and is doing is we are partnering with different organizations. For example, on affordable housing, the Hannibal Square Community Land Trust, we had got 30 units there. Housing Authority, 30 units, another 30 units. Housing Rehabilitation Program, 160, and that's where, through the CRA, people who live in existing homes that need help with roofing, air conditioning, all kinds of issues, we help them pay for it so that they can stay in their homes. Also, Habitat for Humanity, we have 47 homes. And right now what we're doing, and I have to thank Betsy too in the chamber, we are partnering, we're trying to expand, we have what's called the Community Redevelopment Authority, and so with Orange County that oversees Winter Park and a number of other towns and cities. We are looking to expand our boundaries to take care of some areas that are in desperate need of infrastructure work, as far as drainage, septic to sewer, new streets, sidewalks to make it walkable, and all of the things. And in order to do that, if the city partners with Orange County and we can provide the infrastructure to make a project work, then all of the land there, it becomes more affordable working with the private sector for a developer to come in and say, hey, we've paid for all of this, we'll give you more density. Now we want, and what Jerry Demings in Orange County is calling it is housing for all, attainable, same idea. So we are working as a partnership, and when we came to the chamber and said, would you support that, we got a letter that afternoon. So that's how fabulous it is. And so working with the different, and as you said, it's not, when the flooding doesn't know boundaries. When we get our hurricanes, the water comes right into Winter Park from Orange County. It doesn't know that there's a boundary there. So working together with all of the surrounding areas and different organizations and groups, we bring everything together in, and that's why, as Betsy said, the third part of the sector, government, providing some of the infrastructure that can make it affordable for the private sector and giving them more density, which we really don't do right now in Winter Park, but it's a perfect location for it. So those are some of the things that we're doing to address the housing, the green space, making it right, making the infrastructure right, making it good for everybody. So that's what we're doing, partnering. I think that's the best way to describe what we're doing, partnering.
Thank you, Mayor. So Sam, just dovetailing off that, what do you think, our mayor focused on several key areas, what do you think are three key areas of focus when solving for housing, and how are these relevant, do you think, in Winter Park?
So, I mean, housing, I could talk for hours about housing and the different layers to it, but I think the three that I would pick out probably as important ones. One is obviously around affordability, and that's not a single number. That's about looking at the mix of people that you want to have living in a place and making sure there's something that's affordable to that mix that they can afford to live in. I think the second one is around how housing relates to the economy and jobs, and how, if you want to grow the business sector in an area, how do you make sure that the number of jobs that are being created are consistent with the number of homes within a reasonable commute of that workplace. Amazing how often we manage to get that wrong. And then I think the third one is really around community, and it goes back to that, getting the mix right. I mean, it's something, for example, we did struggle with in Mayfair, where the economics of the property market was such that the people living in Mayfair tended to be very polarized between ultra high net worth people who could afford to buy the market value property there, and then at the other end, the affordable housing that we were required to provide through the local authority. And that was something we spent a lot of time trying to work out how we fix that, because that doesn't necessarily make for a sort of balanced community of people living in an area, and you have to think quite carefully how they live alongside each other. But yeah, I think thinking about the community mix where you've got the opportunity to is really important. And one other example on that, we did some work recently with the city of Bath in the southwest of London, of England rather, which you may know from Jane Austen adaptations. She spent a lot of time there. Very nice historic place to live, and as a consequence of that, the local council there was recognising that their housing market was being dominated by relatively wealthy people who had retired, who wanted to live there because it's a nice place to live, and then the affordable housing for the people on low incomes. But as a result of that, they didn't have housing that was attainable to people on middle incomes who were actually going to do the jobs that they needed to drive the economic growth they were looking for. So, and that's partly because of the way decision making is often kind of siloed within a local authority. The planning department wasn't necessarily speaking to the economic development department and working out what's the best long-term outcome. So you might get a benefit from the land sale on the high value housing, but you're missing out on the long-term business rates from a successful local economy. So it's that taking that rounded view is really important.
So we've been talking a little bit about tools in the toolkit. This is for the mayor. What do you think are the tools in the toolkit of an elected official to address the issues of housing and future readiness? And how can Winter Park be future ready using some of the tools you think are in the toolkit for elected officials?
That's a great question, Betsy. And before I answer it, if I could just say in response to Sam, one of the issues that we have in Winter Park, if you look at our labor force, we've got a lot of education with Rollins, a lot of schools.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of health services, so a lot of nurses and staff there. And Winter Park has been basically pricing middle, as you said, income out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Teachers, nurses, nurses,
Yes.
firemen, police, etc. So that's why we're calling it now housing for all, attainable housing,
Yes.
whatever word you want to use. And so that you've got all different levels of housing that we can do. For example, if we can annex that area in and work with the county. It's very, very important to hit all levels, not just make it a very wealthy versus not so wealthy.
Yeah.
But Betsy, in response to your question, the tools in our toolkit, what Winter has tried to do is we have a very healthy reserve. We want to have it at 30% of our general fund. And the reason is we are struck with hurricanes and different things, and we need to be able to get out there, get the streets clear, get the electricity going again, do all of those things.
Which we very much appreciate, by the way.
Yes. And I know people say, why do you need that money? Well, when we just had a Hurricane Ian, and we were able to get all the crews and put them in hotels so that immediately when the rain stopped, we could get those guys out and fixing everything, clearing streets, and we eventually get reimbursed from the federal government, but we need that cash on hand or they'll go someplace else, so they'll get paid first. So that's one of our goals, to have that emergency back funding. Also, we're focusing on renewable energy. That is extremely important. Transportation master plan, we adopted one. Unfortunately, it's like $150 million to implement, so we're working on that. Our parks master plan, very, very important. And really, if you look at the, Betsy, that you sent us, the vision and goals, that's almost verbatim what we're doing in Winter Park. So it's really trying to develop a plan, put the funding in place to make sure that these things happen. And communication is so key. We communicate with our residents saying, what is it you want? They buy into it, and then they have a stake in it. So for us, it makes it easier to implement all of these programs. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do right now.
Thank you, Mayor. Sam, can you talk a little bit about the role of the Mayor of London and some of the projects you've been attached to, or other elected leaders? What have they done to help you collaborate on solutions?
I mean, I think certainly what we find in the work we're doing around place impact investing is that local government has an absolutely critical role. And one of the things that is that one of the first things that investors look at when they're deciding whether to go and invest in a place or not is basically, have we got sensible people involved at local government level? Is there a coherent place strategy? So I think hearing about your approach is really interesting. One of the things we always push for is to have as many local kind of important stakeholders in a place joined up as possible. So it's not just a kind of local government vision, but it's a place vision that is kind of signed up to by local university, maybe local health provider, local employer, and so on. And that is a really important magnet for investment, because one of the things that really frustrates investors is if they go in and start having a conversation, and then often the local government stakeholders just don't have the capacity to kind of follow that up and engage with them on a kind of meaningful basis. So being able to identify projects that form part of a coherent strategy and that are actually shovel ready, a lot of the time, local government will come up with an investment prospectus that has, we've got, I don't know, £10 billion worth of opportunities in our pipeline, but as soon as you actually start probing it, there's maybe 1 billion if you're lucky, because a lot of it's just kind of speculative. So being really clear about what's available is really important. I think there's some really good examples of, across London we have business improvement districts where a lot of the local business community join up to have a kind of coherent voice to feed into those conversations. We certainly had that in Mayfair, and I think also just being grown up and recognising that certainly in a mixed use place like Mayfair, sometimes things will happen that are more beneficial to one part of that community than another, and sometimes you just have to kind of have that open conversation. So bringing those different groups together and then working out what's the best mix it involves a lot of relationship building and trust, I think.
Well, that is a perfect place for us to stop, because we want to explore this further, and I'm grateful that Sam is traveling all the way over from London to be with us on September 20th, which is a Friday, at the Alfond Inn. He'll be framing this discussion for us, and as you can see, we're very fortunate to have our mayor already invested in this conversation. So we want to thank Mayor DeCiccio for her time and engagement, not just today, but in the broader conversation about a based strategy where we can enable Winter Park to be the best version of itself going forward into the future, while naturally meeting the pressing demands of the reality of the hurricane season that we're in right now. So we appreciate what a delicate balancing act that is, and want to thank you, Mayor DeCiccio, for your engagement on this topic. I think it's going to be a really worthwhile community conversation, and I know we'll be having a couple of other meetings with Sam. One of the things that's important to us is to democratize our content, so we'll be following up with Sam in another podcast afterwards, bringing this conversation forward. But I am absolutely delighted, Sam, that you've made room in your diary to be with us in September, because I think you've got a unique perspective on this and can really help us with some best practice thinking as we start to shape a vision of how to become a future-ready city here in Winter Park. We want to thank our presenting sponsor of Outlook, Rollins College, certainly for hosting Outlook, but also for the hospitality today on this podcast. And we just are so grateful to be working in partnership with the city, the chamber, and Rollins for solutions that will enable Winter Park, as you rightly point out, Sam, to compete and also to maintain an adequate focus on the context of the region that we serve. So I want to thank you both for spending time today. There's so much more to come. This is just a small taste of what we're going to be talking about, and we hope that you'll log on to winterpark.org to register for your ticket to the Winter Park Outlook. Again, Mayor DeCiccio, thank you, and Sam Monger from London, we appreciate your time here today.